Next, I'd like to welcome our panelists for our InfoSec session. I want to thank Chris Hymes from Riot Games, one of our great customers, tons of great feedback for us, as well as panelists Alex from Remitly, Chris Wheeler from Morgan Stanley, and Omer from Snowflake. This should be a really exciting conversation about how synthetic data is actually revolutionizing the entire cybersecurity industry, something close to our heart that we see quite often on a day-to-day basis. So I'd like to welcome the panel for this one.
Hey, my name is Chris Hymes. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Riot Games, and I'm super excited to help facilitate what will hopefully be an amazing conversation on kind of the world of information security, data privacy, synthetic data, and you name it. I have three awesome guests here with me, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Maybe we'll jump to you, Alex.
Hey, I'm Alex Maestretti. I'm the CISO at Remitly. We are a financial services company for immigrants and their families.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. How about you, Omer?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm Omer Singer. I lead cybersecurity strategy at Snowflake. We are the data cloud company, and I'm playing around with this synthetic data stuff. So looking forward to chatting about it.
Thanks, dude. Chris, how about you, man?
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Wheeler. I'm a cybersecurity specialist at Morgan Stanley. We are a large financial services.
Cool. Well, what you have here are four people who are not experts in moderation nor giving talks, but we're just hopefully going to just have a pretty good conversation amongst us. And I think the area I wanted to start first, there's a lot of confusion all the time around kind of like, what the heck do security teams do nowadays? How do they blend and how are they different from data privacy teams and compliance teams in kind of a modern enterprise? So I'm just curious to get each of your perspectives who kind of lead teams and have led teams in the past at a lot of different companies. Like, what is the security team's role in a modern enterprise? Maybe Chris, we'll start with you since you were last time.
Sure. So for our company, you imagine we're doing things all over the business, things proactively, things in response to given events, fraud prevention, cloud. There's all sorts of different things that a security team is being asked for. More and more, we're seeing that be in both cloud and on-premises environments. So really kind of all over the map and a mix of, like I said, proactive and responsive type capabilities.
Cool.
Yeah, and I want to jump in on that because I think the proactive could be tactical and saying, okay, there's a certain threat that we want to kind of be proactive in detecting and mitigating it. But I think there's also proactive strategies that we see emerging where when it was a simpler time when we were all operating on-prem, with a perimeter, remember those days? So I think the task of the security team, like the strategies were around that environment. We had endpoints, we had servers, we had the network. And then this cloud thing started happening. And I think there was a point in time where there was a sense that the cloud would have some built-in security to it because it was being provided as a service. And so the security team could kind of keep focusing on what's been doing. And while cloud is delivered to us as this kind of secure service environment that are different parts the company could just use. And then we had kind of a rude awakening where actually that's not the case, right? And there's this shared responsibility model, and we do need to be thoughtful and have a strategy around how as a security organization we're going to lock down this cloud environment, monitor it, be ready to respond to threats and to breaches in the cloud environment. And what's really interesting is that the same kind of thing, and it might sound crazy and naive now, right? Why would anybody think that? But actually, if you look at how many security teams today think about data and data cloud, data platforms, supporting kind of all the interesting things that the enterprise is doing with data, I think there's some of that naivety there now as well, and kind of an assumption that there's our back and these environments are pretty locked down, and I think there's now this awakening around data where we do need to have a data security strategy, and how do we ensure that the right people see the data and they're not abusing their access, and data we care about is not leaving the environment. And so it is interesting, and there's a lot of data security tooling that's coming in, but also the synthetic data stuff. So I think in terms of strategy, we're thinking about that area as well now.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of that resonates as those are commonalities across a lot of different approaches to security. But I think, from the CISO perspective, like starting from who your customer is and what business that you're in is going to help define how your security team approaches and what the scope of your responsibilities are. So, Chris H, you've got experience with Hulu. I was formerly at Netflix. Riot, your entertainment companies, business to consumer, is a different flavor than fintech, business to consumer, different flavor than business to business. And so each of those sort of customer sets are going to have different relationships with security and with privacy. I would say in the fintech space, I think consumers resonate with privacy probably pretty strongly, and obviously care about security, but maybe more in the abstract. The consumers are going to rely on regulators to really represent them in terms of technical security in a lot of cases. So you've got a regulatory landscape of basically proxies for your customer, and you'll be doing a lot of work with them from a governance, risk, and compliance perspective. Versus B2B, right, where you've got a sort of sales enablement feature around your security program where you're trying to make your partners comfortable that you're doing your best on behalf of their customers. So I think a lot of that drives it is, what business are you in? Understanding profit and loss and, go-to-market strategy, all those sorts of things around how your company operates, and then really getting empathy for the customers that you're serving, and then backing into, how you implement the more tactical things on locking down data, increasing privacy, all those sorts of areas. And so certainly, to tie it back to the synthetics thing, I think across a lot of those, sales enablement, right, certainly in the security space, I think is an interesting one for synthetics. It's very hard to test security products on your own prod data. And then also sort of in more the B2C side, like, can you not share consumer data with partners? Can you not share it with your pre-prod environments? Can you do more to maintain sort of the privacy boundaries of those consumer data items?
So it's interesting because, Alex, you're using or giving us some use cases, but also talking about privacy quite a bit. And Omer, you were talking about, a bit of privacy and data usage, and the word regulatory came up a couple of times. I know within Riot, I'm not only accountable for security, but I'm also accountable for data privacy. And I'm curious if you all have kind of seen data privacy and security coming closer together within your companies, and how you've been tackling some of the data privacy and security related issues together in relation to some of the regulatory compliance and things we've been seeing happen across the world.
Yeah, well, I can share that one of the kinds of business customers that we support are advertising companies, and they are really trying to find new ways to collaborate in a way that maintains that privacy. Because if they don't, well, then they can't collaborate at all. But there's so much value in being able to understand kind of their customers in a combined way. So it's very much a business enabler. And yeah, I think cybersecurity has a role to play. We have our experience in the space, and also thinking about adversaries and how that privacy might be targeted and abused. So if we can be a voice in that conversation, then absolutely, I think that's a role that we should be playing.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, from a financial services perspective, this is baked into our DNA. Something that's been going on for years. Everything from PCI up to the much more modern regulatory standards. I think it's almost second nature, and we have a lot of these controls built in around who can access data, how it will be reported, and legal review is a part of just about everything that we do. So very excited to see some development in this front, where we might be able to do these pseudo-anonymized data sets, or that could help security teams, which are particularly needing to test with that prod-like data to evaluate the efficacy of controls. And also just, even if it's not the control itself, how do you present that to an analyst? How do you test and train? It's increasingly important for our teams that are dealing with these multiple data sets and putting it together.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it like you can't have privacy without security. So security is a prerequisite, right? You have to be able to safeguard the data you've been entrusted with. But security alone is not enough for privacy. So you need, starting with good data governance, you need to articulate the justification for why you're collecting a given piece of information, have retention schedules for why you're keeping it, how long, and watch it through that whole life cycle. So I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of rolling out a security program and then rolling out a privacy program. So there's, we also have them both within my organization, but I do try to draw a distinction in terms of, they are different programs, different disciplines, requires sort of learning on my part to come up to speed on some of the privacy concepts and the regulatory frameworks. I'd say the regulatory landscape is probably leaning more into privacy. I think especially as we have more like consumer protection boards in various countries across the world. And so there's a real recognition that folks care about their privacy, and that we need some good frameworks that we're all talking the same language in terms of what that looks like. I think one of the foundational problems that I've seen pretty much everywhere that I've worked, when I've talked to, is the data inventory problem, like finding all of your data and classifying it if it's privacy sensitive. And so, some of the machine learning, AI, even the generative space for the classifiers that go out and help you do that, I think is super interesting. But has been expensive in the past. Some AWS tools were quite expensive. I think the cost has come down a bit. I think there's some more, as the technology advances, it becomes more tractable to run those at scale or sort of sample across your space. But yeah, building those data maps and things is sort of a step one for data governance that I think a lot of folks still need to do.
And do you see that happening within security programs, or is that kind of data classification more in the realm of the CIO's org and the data team, and it's on them, right? Because I think they care about it too, right? Who's responsible for that?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on your governance structure. I think there's a number of places that can benefit from it. At least the way that I've thought about it is oftentimes you'll have like a data engineering team that has, the data warehouse, the data lake, those sorts of things. Maybe you have a different like persistence group that does like the operational data stores, and then you probably have some stuff in the corporate world. So you need something that federates all those things up to a common view. And it's going to depend on sort of where the expertise and momentum is in that organization, right? So yeah, if the scope of your data team is sort of across all those different domains, then it could be there. Otherwise, you might want some sort of dedicated data governance or privacy function. And then also in the financial space, right, you're always thinking about sort of the 3 lines of defense. So who operationally implements it, who sort of oversees that, and then who's the final checker on it, right? And so you're going to have different groups with some separation of sort of concerns to do all 3 of those functions.
It's interesting, Alex, because it comes back to, again, what's the role of a security team in a modern enterprise, right? You have some enterprises and teams, and there's no right or wrong answer, that people come in and they check a little bit more, they just do detection. And then there are teams that also say, hey, if I'm going to ask you to do something and implement something, I'm going to write the tool or provide the tool for you to do it. And that's where I've seen some delineation with like where privacy engineering might sit within security, and you might have privacy reviewers and auditors that might sit in the compliance organization. How have you all seen that working, or how does it work within your companies?
Again, I think it's an interesting one for security, right? You want to be an enabler. So if you're going to set a security bar or a privacy bar, you want to help your company to meet that. But then when you think about the 3-line model defense, you need some separation on sort of the maker and the checker. And so that is important to strike that right balance. And maybe like you build a tool and then you hand it off to someone else to operate, right? And then you're more in the checking, and then you have audit, like internal audit, to be your 3rd line. So yeah, I think that's generally been our approach. So we IPO'd about a year ago. Pre-IPO, the infrastructure, security, and IT teams all reported to me. And so like we worked together to do that enablement function with a focus on securing the customer. Post-IPO, especially like regulators want to see more separation of those duties. So we broke those things apart, right? So I think as a company matures, you're probably going to see more specialization and more of those different layers stratify out. But if you're a 10-person startup, then it's going to be probably mostly your engineering org is going to be doing all those sorts of things, right? If you're JP Morgan, then you're going to have a much larger staff to handle the separation of duties.
What about you, Chris? How does it work at Morgan Stanley?
Yeah, I was going to say, Alex stepped through, really nailed it, kind of 1st line, 2nd line, 3rd line controls. I'm sure you can gather from some of my commentary, I'm more on the first line of controls there on the more technical side. But then as you step up, you're getting people that are looking at those higher level metrics and how they might, everything from how many true positive incidents a certain organization has kind of churned through to where we might be, vulnerable to a particular software vulnerability, those 2nd line controls there, and then with those checks on audit and those 3rd line controls. So that's kind of the tried and true model that Alex has alluded to there as well. And it was interesting to me too, during the panel, we kind of stepped through that with me starting down there with a very technical on the cloud, and here's how it's looking. And then Omar went up to the strategy, and then Alex kind of at the CISO level, you can see the some of those things kind of manifest themselves.
Yeah. So, Alex, you talked about kind of data governance being a big challenge. I think even from a security perspective, the inventory and understanding your environment has always been challenging, right? It's getting easier again with more cloud-based tools and kind of compliance as code, networking as code, et cetera, but it's still challenging. What would you all say right now? Is it data governance and understanding where your data is? That is and data inventory is the biggest challenge when it comes to kind of data, protecting data and things like that in your environments?
I think it is foundational. And I agree, like your inventory example from security really resonates. So, back in the day, I remember you would have network segments behind NATs that you didn't know about. And so as a security person, you'd have all these sort of areas of all these computers in an entire building, and it was pretty embarrassing when you didn't know that those existed. And so now it's much better with the cloud because you can pull your inventory from the APIs. I think the same advantages apply to the data inventory in general. If you're in a cloud platform, the APIs are there. Most cloud platforms are creating new ways to store data at a pretty rapid pace, so it's kind of hard to keep up with where all those things are. But yeah, still those tools that give you an aggregated view, especially if you're multi-cloud, or maybe you have some on-prem still, or you've got your sort of general cloud platform and you've got SaaS platforms, like getting all those things together in one common view, I think is still challenging. So I think it could be fair to call that the biggest challenge. I think the data governance piece built around the inventory is broader than that in terms of what are acceptable uses for data. How do you balance the needs of the business or the desires of individual employees to have broad access to data with what the regulators and therefore your customers really want to see in terms of controls around them. And so synthetics potentially offer sort of a double win there, where you don't have to have as much of that concern over controlling the data, and you can let folks sort of run wild in it. I think our challenge has been convincing the data analysts and the engineers and whatnot that the synthetic data will serve their needs. And so, anytime we can give them small examples of that, where they get little wins and good reinforcement, I think that's going to be the key to unlocking a lot of it.
No, I think that's interesting, because we all probably recognize that prevention is never going to be 100%. And we need to understand not just kind of where the sensitive data is and what are the policies governing who can access it, but also looking at who is actually accessing it, right? And looking at it from the user's perspective, and who's touching what data and where are they moving it, and taking that kind of user perspective, use case perspective, monitoring the queries, monitoring the data movement, and taking action based on that. And I think you raise an interesting point. I haven't thought about this before, but if you do build a good understanding of who's using what data, then you can start recommending, hey, it looks like you're using a lot of this kind of data, and it's cool, but you're introducing quite a bit of risk by moving this stuff around. And actually, we have a pretty darn good synthetic alternative for this data set. So can we suggest, that you use this? That would actually be a pretty good way to get teams more comfortable relying on synthetic data where it makes sense.
Now, I know some of us have more experience and less experience with synthetic data, but I think we all understand the value and the premise of where it could be and how it could really help security and data privacy. Have you all tried or experimented within your organizations any kind of use cases for synthetic data within the security space?
I can share from my experience where tool evaluation was a consideration, and at Snowflake we really believe that the security teams are going to want to use cloud data platforms for different security use cases, including threat detection, threat hunting, incident response. They're going to want to do it at scale, but we recognize that it's new for many security teams. And I think synthetic data is an opportunity to take something that's working in other areas and apply it to cybersecurity, potentially to solve this challenge of how do you evaluate these new tools? Because it's an exciting prospect, right? The scale and the analytics capabilities, hey, that's exciting for the security team. But how do you cut through the noise and what the vendors might be telling you and promising you, the moon, and you really need to put it to the test? I think the reality is that different platforms are built for different use cases, and certain things will fail at certain scales, at certain latencies, certain kinds of questions. And so once you do have a sense for how you're thinking about kind of your next generation of threat detection, incident response, security analytics. Looking at synthetic data is potentially helpful. And we did take, so for an example that we did is we had some cloud data, and we had 10,000 say records of AWS activity logs, and we wanted to see what would performance look like when we try to do this kind of threat hunting at multi-terabyte scale. And where we couldn't use production data for that evaluation, the synthetic data was helpful, but I got to share from the experience. It was less magical than I expected. Like I thought that, here's a little, you plant a little seed and it grows into this like unlimited amount of very realistic data. I think the reality is it does take work. And in the beginning, the data was too similar to the source. And we found some strings that shouldn't have been in there that we couldn't use for the POC, and we need to go back and redact those. But again, no magic here. When they were redacted, it was redacted kind of too hard to just X'd out. Well, okay, let's find a balance so that the results we get are going to be representative of the kind of performance that we could expect at production scale. But the potential is exciting, and going from POCs that might take months to POCs that could take days at realistic scales without risking exposing production data, it could definitely be the future of POCs for security tooling.
Yeah, I was just going to say I haven't done it, and I won't say there's nowhere in Morgan Stanley that's doing this. I'm sure some part of the business is experimenting with synthetics, but my experience has mostly been personal use. And one of the things I was trying out was how to generate Windows event logs that were of interest. And the thing that I was realizing as I walked through this was how much of those more categorical features didn't map so neatly. So it almost goes into the masking thing. If you mask the term administrator, it means something completely different to a security analyst than the original term. So it was really, I really had to think through what features I would really want to extract about those. It wasn't as simple as just feed it in and then have it spit out, representative logs. And that just speaks to some of the challenges we see with synthetics and InfoSec is the data is so interrelated in different data sets, right? So I went in with the hypothesis of event logs, one thing, but realistically it's for much narrower use cases. Things like, if you're looking at packets, there's a lot more discrete features you can extract and numerically related ones that synthetic data might be a lot more suited for.
Chris, sounds like you went all the way, like synthetic PowerShell event logs, probably the craziest thing. Like, wow,
I tried,
okay.
it did not go well. So lessons learned.
Yeah, so it makes me think of like, how could we modify and train additional layers on these models to make them more domain specific? So I think, whether it's CloudTrail, PowerShell, like, are we drawing from the right corpus of training data, or are there ways to sort of customize and tweak these models? Which, like, I just started reading some of the background papers and things on it to try and like get smart on how these things are actually operating. But another example that I'll throw out there that was exciting when I first saw it on Twitter, which is sort of, cherry picking these positive outcomes, was like writing IAM code, like AWS, access policies, because that's, a big burden on the security team to double check those, make sure those are correct. And here you could sort of write in, English language, your intent, and it would produce this IAM policy. Similar to how, they can produce code like Python code and things like that. But then you start thinking about, but their training corpus is probably like Stack Overflow, which has all these very bad examples in it, right? Or all these examples that they work, but they are not production grade, or they leave out sort of important pieces as a teaching moment. So, I think that's one of the challenges with some of these generative models is you don't know the correctness of the answer, right? And the answers are also non-deterministic. So, I like to joke that I could, just retire and replace myself with a GPT that talks, vaguely about risk, right? But I think that would be just as frustrating as the real CISO, because you get a different answer each time you ask a question. So, how can we leverage some of these tools to plug the gaps in judgment, but not create a bigger problem?
Yeah, I think ever since ChatGPT came out, unlimited CISOs have been trying to replace themselves, but it hasn't worked yet. But we'll see where that goes. So we've been talking about some of the interesting use cases kind of more on like the product testing side. Obviously one of the hardest things within security, I happen to think, is actually threat detection, right? Because many of the threats kind of could look like a normal behavior from somebody. Do you think there could be any place in kind of creating these data sets, replicating logs, using synthetics to help us actually run through some, I'm not going to call them red team exercises, but testability of our tools and detections to see if there's anything with malicious in our environments?
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's plenty of potential here. I think one of the things I found interesting, kind of doing a literature review ahead of this, was just the amount of data sets that are available. It's a very low number if you look at some of the research on this, and you look at that, and I think I counted 20, maybe 21 that were available over the last 20 years. And you think about that as an InfoSec professional, you're like, that's 20 different networks, 20 different, am I even getting a representative sample right there? So I think one of the things that will be exciting in this space is to get more of those larger data sets and get some community validation around those things, so that they could, to your point, kind of be a common set of test data for if you're putting out, say, a network sensing product, a network IDS. These are the type of attacks you would want to detect. They are contained within this data set. They are, and kind of building some standards around those things would be a really cool thing. But it will take, to all the challenges we've been discussing, it will take a lot of validation by security professionals to make sure that's actually represented, and of course buy-in by vendors and others that are producing those tools.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think you have to have some sort of continuous synthetic generation. Otherwise you overfit and just detect, yeah, we detect that. Well, sure, you did, but okay, will you detect the next one? And I think the parallel that we can look at is if you look at endpoint protection and the move from signature-based detection to what, the CrowdStrikes of the world do today. The reason why they were able to train the models to do it successfully is because they had access to millions and millions of malware samples. And only at that scale were they able to kind of learn what malware looks like and move from writing very specific signatures. And I think where we are with threat detection today, outside of the endpoint, is still in that signature. We try to kind of keep up with the attacks by pumping out signatures. It didn't work then. It's not going to work now. And so I'd love to see somebody take that on, because Chris, I think that's exactly right. There's a real shortage, and hopefully synthetics come up so that we can put the machines to work for a broader set of detection use cases.
Yeah, I recall when I was first transitioning out of government into a private sector, and Apple was sort of the first wave of like ML focused detection tooling. And so I was super interested. It's like, oh, okay, cool. This sounds very interesting. Can I just throw data at this and have it tell me when stuff looks weird, right? But as I sort of picked through the products, or at least the tooling at the time, a lot of it was they might use some ML techniques to analyze the data, but then they would basically use that to write a heuristic, write a rule, a signature, and apply that in prod, at that sort of scale and throughput. And very few of them were actually like tuning models on your data. It was more, a tool to use on the back end and then apply these. And so, circling back to it now, it seems like, again, in my limited understanding of some of these generative models, like the large language models, when you get these order of magnitude step ups, you get just like entirely different behaviors. So it's not that the technology is necessarily new, but it seems like we're getting close to that point where, yes, you could just throw raw PCAP at the thing and it would extract like every possible dimension of it and then train on that. And so you're not having to define features, right? Which is basically like your expert opinion saying these things are relevant. It's going to look at all the stuff. And I guess there's still sort of like the attention network layers that you're going to help point in the right directions and things like that. But if you could get to that point where it's bringing you insights versus you, sort of training it your insights to go bring back things, like that could be very interesting. I think, as alluded to, you need large volumes of data and like lots of dimensions, a lot of compute to put that together. And I don't know that we've tried that just yet on the security space, but it could be interesting. I certainly think about sort of adjacent to security, the platform abuse space, right? All the bots that are sending traffic against any public website, trying to stuff credentials or scrape pricing or whatever it is. Could you throw all the dimensions in an HTTP header packet combination and have it tell you that it can tell what a tool is, right? Because there you've got a lot of data, high data rates. You've got access to the attacker tools generally, so you could run them, right, to develop sort of labeled data sets and then see what it could do better than the existing sort of edge detection things.
Well, hopefully there's some entrepreneurs listening to this and saying, I'm going to build a company to do that. Because there's definitely progress being made. Just actually this morning on Twitter, speaking on Twitter, I saw there's this somebody released Infinite Seinfeld, where they trained a model on all the Seinfeld episodes, and now there's just a new Seinfeld episode that never ends, and they're having conversations. And I saw they're talking about some candy bar that has 2 flavors, and Elaine brought it up, and George was reacting to it, and it feels like a Seinfeld episode. It was never in any episode of Seinfeld, right? So if we could have networks like that, right, with some subtle attack, some lateral movement going on in the background, yeah, that'd be really cool too.
So it sounds like the person who wrote that Seinfeld bot should be working in information security. That's what I'm hearing from all this. So.
Yeah, if he wants to raise, yeah.
So cool. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I kind of just wanted to wrap it up with just a closing question. So I'll hit each of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Chris. What problems do you really see for the InfoSec industry over the next kind of 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, so I think I don't know if it would necessarily be like a full-on problem, but it's definitely a difference. So we've talked a little bit about like migration to cloud and use of ML. We see a lot of consolidation around some of the larger vendors, and like from a security team perspective, we're a lot of times learning to understand those signatures that may not be inspectable to what Alex was talking about. So it's a different way of working. In theory, that is better. It's more automated. It's moving us ahead, but it's also tougher sometimes for those newer analysts to kind of understand where those came from and what they need to do. The other thing that I think is probably no surprise is just all these exciting technologies for automation and good purposes being used against us on the defensive side. There's plenty of stuff about GPT algorithms being used to generate phishing emails, which is going to keep me up at night, those type of things. And then just like the scale of these cloud platforms, if you can use them for good, they can also be abused. So those are the 2 main things that I see in the space.
How about you, Omer?
I think it's this partnership that's emerging between cybersecurity teams and data teams, so that the security team can both understand what's happening in the data platform and also take advantage of innovation and tooling in the data space. We talked about kind of synthetic data and data platforms and all these different ways in which the security team can be better, but not operating on its own, but rather through partnership with the data organization. I think that's a big opportunity and a trend that we're going to continue to see.
How about you, Alex?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think we saw this evolution with sort of application security becoming closer to cloud security, and a lot of the leverage that you have in a cloud platform being on ensuring sort of proper configuration there on our sort of operational prod side. And so probably more of that into the data space as companies, learn to leverage their data in different ways and, continue to move from older techniques of data exploitation into the modern realm. I think security is going to need to keep up with them. And so that's definitely an area. I guess this is going to be like the same problems we've had before, right? Social engineering, unintended consequences of great new technologies that enhance sharing or enhance velocity. Those are great, but then there's always security tail and risk to think of.
Yeah, new problem, same as the old problem.
Pretty much, yeah.
Cool. Well, I for one, I enjoyed the chat and conversation. I hope you all did as well, and just wanted to thank you for jumping on this panel.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.